and France24.com.
Hello, you're watching France 24. It's 9 a.m. here in Paris. Let's get you up to date with our headlines. A first for France. All 11 presidential candidates battle it out in a 4-hour-long live TV debate. We'll be picking through the analysis. Syrian government and opposition allies pitted against each other in explaining how a chemical gas killed more than 70, 20 of them children, in northwest Syria. And France's government in deadlock with French Guiana's strikers who have escalated their protest by occupying a rocket launch centre. Hello to you. This is today's Live from Paris with me, Belle Lupton. Also coming up on the programme, Donald Trump says he's going to give banking rules a haircut. But is it really going to help people get loans? We'll have more in our business update. And building sandcastles on a giant scale. We'll be taking you to a sculpture park where you can really not want to fall onto one of those exhibits. Find out more in the programme. At times chaotic and scrappy, it was also a first for France. All 11 presidential candidates verbally battling it out on TV over a whopping 4 hours. Commentators praised a strong performance in last night's debate by far-left candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Most fiery criticism came from Philippe Poutou of the new anti-capitalist party, the only candidate not in a suit. He's a car factory worker. He turned on François Fillon over the Les Républicains candidates' recent corruption scandals. All eyes were on the two frontrunners, though. Far-right Marine Le Pen was repeatedly held to account by centrist Emmanuel Macron, who showed himself more combative than in the first debate. Sharon Gaffney takes us through it all as it happened.
An unprecedented debate involving all 11 candidates for the French presidency. Some of the most heated exchanges took place over Europe. Far-right candidate Marine Le Pen wants France to take control of its borders, scrap the euro and leave the EU.
Without intelligent economic protectionism, we will see the job market crumble and economic sectors will crumble as well.
But centrist Emmanuel Macron accused Le Pen of economic warfare, saying her policies would harm French exports.
Mrs. Le Pen says she'll abolish European rules and have a tax policy to protect jobs. That's great, but look at where our farmers export. 40% of French milk goes to Europe. Fruit and vegetables are also massively exported.
The rivals to the two frontrunners were hoping the debate would give them a chance to close the gap on Macron and Le Pen. Conservative candidate François Fillon was criticised about allegations that his wife and family were paid for jobs they didn't do.
No, I have not made any mistakes, and I refuse to respond to any questions on this topic.
Socialist Party candidate Benoît Hamon took a swipe at Fillon's pledge to reduce the size of the civil service.
What Mr. Fillon forgot to tell us is that he will start by downsizing 500,000 public sector jobs, so he's going to have to create a lot of jobs if he wants to reduce unemployment.
The campaign has been focused on the 5 main contenders for the presidency, but this debate allowed the 6 minor candidates to step into the spotlight for the first time. With polls showing about a third of voters still undecided, it remains to be seen how much of an impact a debate between all 11 candidates will have in influencing the momentum of the campaign.
Well, let's roll up our sleeves and do some analysis on the performance of the 11 candidates in that presidential debate. To do that, I'm joined in the studio now by Frederic Paillet. He's a communications specialist and senior vice president of Reputation Squad, which is an international communications agency. Hello, Frederic. Thanks for being with us.
Hello to you.
Now, it may have gone on for a few hours, that debate, but with 11 candidates on the stage, how is it possible for all of them to get their message across?
Well,
it was a real challenge. It was the first, as you said earlier. It was an unprecedented debate in France. You had two sub-teams of that football team. You had the five main candidates, being Fillon, Le Pen, Macron, Mélenchon, and Hamon. And you have six others. And these six candidates were really there to make their point. It was, in a way, their Warholian 15 minutes of fame. They had 17, I think. It lasted for nearly 4 hours. So it was very, very, very long. Now, I'd say that as expected, the five main candidates were just there to make sure that everything was fine. They're already being really seen in the media. The six others had to show that they were there, that they were existing.
So they had more to prove, essentially.
They had more to prove. They were there to push, to put pressure on the five others. We had some moments of tension with some, for instance, the anti-capitalist candidate Philippe Poutou, who was very aggressive with, for instance, Fillon because of his scandals, and also Marine Le Pen. They had no inhibitions, in a way. So it was, in terms of communications, it was interesting because it's rather unusual in France.
So did you feel as though those five smaller candidates were able to hold the mainstream candidates to account a little bit more than they would between themselves?
Well, they tried to. For instance, when Philippe Poutou told Marine Le Pen that, well, she's being summoned by judges, and because of her European MP immunity, she can afford not going. He said, well, you have your MP immunity, and I, as a worker, have no immunity. So thanks very much.
Yeah, calling those candidates out. Is there a danger, though, that this sort of 11-way debate means that you have to grab that one soundbite or that moment of tension in order to get seen?
Yes, but it very much depends on the way you do it. In a way, we had no kings standing out last night, but we had at least one or a couple of jesters, which was problematic. Jean Lassalle, who's an MP here in France, was totally disconnected from the debate. And Philippe Poutou once more, and also Nathalie Arthaud, another Trotskyist, we do have Trotskyist candidates in France, were out of the game and also very much in the game. And as I said, they had their own standards of communications, totally separated from what the others were doing. And
watching that debate for you, was there one candidate from a communications perspective who really stood out above the rest? Well, I'd say that the candidate that did really well, because he was very comfortable in this debate, was Mélenchon, the far left candidate, one of the far left candidates, because he is one of the main candidates. He's one of these professional politicians, experienced politicians. So he knows how to be the perfect candidate, but he also knows how to be a marginal candidate. So he was very at ease between the ones who were who can expect to be elected, and the others, the marginal ones. So he did really, really well. And as usual, he knows how to shout when he has to shout. He knows how to give the right catch sentences. He did really very well. So speaking in sound bites and kind of capitalising, I guess, on his first very high performance in that first debate as well. Frederic Paillet, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much for your analysis on that presidential debate last night. Well, let's leave the French presidential race behind for a minute, and we're going to turn to Syria, where at least 72 people, 20 of them children, are said to have died, and hundreds more have been wounded by toxic chemicals in the northwestern province of Idlib. The Syrian opposition and its coalition forces are accusing Bashar al-Assad's forces of carrying out a chemical airstrike, while the government's ally Russia says the poisonous gas escaped from a rebel chemical weapons depot after it was hit by a Syrian government airstrike. The US, Britain and France are asking for an urgent UN resolution to condemn the attack. It's not the first time Bashar al-Assad's forces have been accused of carrying out chemical attacks on civilians during Syria's 6-year war. The military denies these claims. Alexander Hurst reports.
For the residents of Idlib, the evidence is clear that they were attacked with a toxin far more serious than the chlorine gas they say has been regularly used so far in northern Syria.
The patients keep just flooding in from this chemical attack, and everyone has got pinpoint people, every single patient. They don't have smell of chlorine. This is not a chlorine attack. This is definitely not a chlorine attack.
Among the dozens of dead and hundreds wounded that have overwhelmed the region's hospitals are numerous children.
I was asleep when the warplane hit us. I went outside with Dad, but my head started hurting. I fell asleep and woke up to find myself here.
The UN Special Envoy to Syria says that there is no concrete proof about what type of chemical may have been used, but that it came from at least one airstrike. The attack coincided with a meeting of top diplomats in Brussels to discuss the Syrian conflict. Many were quick to blame Bashar al-Assad, as well as his allies. Though the Syrian government has repeatedly denied using chemical weapons, this isn't the first time it stands accused of what would amount to a war crime. In 2013, Assad's forces were accused of firing sarin gas rockets at rebel-held areas of Damascus, killing 1,000 people. Since then, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has concluded that 1,500 people have been killed in chemical attacks perpetrated by the Syrian government, and that opposition forces have also used similar types of weapons.
Well, all this comes as representatives from more than 70 countries are meeting in Brussels to raise money for Syria's refugees. 5 million have fled the country and over 6 million are displaced within Syria. This latest conference aims to raise more than €8 billion to help the internally displaced, as well as the countries that they've fled to. Aid agencies are warning that funding for Syria's refugees is dangerously low. The countries they've fled to are also feeling that strain. Protesters in Guyana have been on strike for over 10 days, keeping businesses shut and blocking much of the economy. Now, to put more pressure on the French government, some in the French territory have taken their protests to the space centre in Kourou, the heart of France's space industry. This report is by our France 24 team, Fanny Lothaire, on the ground in French Guiana.
French Guiana's protesters have found their symbol, a fist with a slogan, Guiana Rising. The logo used by the group that launched the strike is now also a sculpture.
We're putting our fist on the table without breaking anything. We're being heard by raising our arms in the air, singing and blocking the economy.
Protesters have been blocking businesses, but not only that, they're also cutting off this road, which leads to France's strategic space center in Kourou. Hundreds of demonstrators have settled outside the highly secured site. Some say it is Guyana's ultimate bargaining chip. Protesters are determined to get up to €3 billion of aid from Paris.
We're only asking for what we absolutely need to live here. That's why so many people are mobilized. The Space Centre is a flagship of the European space programme. The issue has international dimensions. We're using it to be heard by everyone.
More than 24 protesters are inside, occupying management offices. They say they're not planning to leave.
The people who are inside decided to stay in the offices until the government meets again.
Next to the lawyer, the site's director, who has been staying in his office with the protesters. The head of the European Space Centre is expected in Kourou. The company is anxious to defuse the crisis. It loses €500,000 every day the Kourou site remains closed.
And now the mountains of Portugal. Now they're dotted with castles, but on the coast in the Algarve, there's a very different kind of castle being built. Welcome to the International Sand Sculpture Festival, a massive competition in, yeah, you guessed it, sand building. Over 45,000 tonnes of sand set, over 15,000 square metres of exhibition space. Competitors have to sculpt the wet sand into something beautiful, from famous faces, that's Bob Marley there, to beautiful buildings. A bit of Mick Jagger, some more recognisable than others. The idea is to create a sand city this year that visitors can walk through. And it's open until the end of October, so you've got plenty of time to go and check it out. It's 9:15 here in Paris. Let's remind you of our headlines. A first for France. All 11 presidential candidates battle it out in a 4-hour-long live TV debate. We'll be picking through the analysis. And Syrian government and opposition allies pitted against each other in explaining how chemical gas killed more than 70, 20 of them children, in northwest Syria. Business news now, and Stephen Carroll joins me in the studio. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Belle.
And we're starting in the US, where Donald Trump is gearing up for this all sorts of changing regulation on banks.
Donald Trump says he's going to give banking rules a haircut to make it easier for them to lend money to people. In particular, he wants to overhaul the Dodd-Frank reforms that were introduced after the financial crisis. Mr. Trump claims the rules hurt lending, but in fact, loans to consumers have increased dramatically since the reforms were introduced. Speaking to business leaders on Tuesday, Mr. Trump said that work had already begun on the changes. Yuka Royer has the story.
That's so beautiful.
Inviting business leaders to the White House, Donald Trump said the era of what he saw as horrible banking regulations would soon be over.
So we're going to do a very major haircut on Dodd-Frank. We want strong restrictions. We want strong regulation, but not regulation that makes it impossible for the banks to loan to people that are going to create jobs.
Trump's target, the Dodd-Frank Act, was signed into law in 2010 after the financial crisis, which saw hundreds of billions of taxpayer money poured into bailing out banks. The aim of the law was to reduce systemic risks to avoid another recession, subjecting banks to more stringent regulation and giving better protection to consumers. The Act created a federal financial stability oversight council to monitor the health of banks that are too big to fail, and required banks to keep enough cash to face potential crises. It also aimed to rein in reckless lending by restricting loans to only those who could afford them. Many Wall Street executives have been lobbying for a rollback of Dodd-Frank. In his annual letter to investors, JP Morgan's CEO Jamie Dimon said that while many of the rules are fine, it is clear that the banks have too much capital, and more of that capital can be safely used to finance the economy. The US president already ordered a review of the act in early February, but the administration has yet to deliver details of an alternative plan. And despite Trump's claim that it's been disastrous for the banks, data shows Dodd-Frank hasn't slowed down lending. Since the law was enacted, lending to consumers and businesses has continued to grow to record levels, and so have the bank's profits.
Donald Trump's also on the mind of stock market investors today ahead of his meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping tomorrow in Florida. Chinese markets back in business today. They were closed earlier in the week. They're trading up, boost particularly for construction firms after a plan announced over the weekend to build a new special economic zone, which was trying to replicate the success of Shenzhen. So that's giving those construction firms a boost. In Europe at the start of trading, it's a pretty flat start to the day, actually. We've just got some gains on London's FTSE 100 up around a third of 1%, but flat starts in Paris and in Frankfurt.
And tell us a bit more about this story, Stephen. A high-profile official has resigned from America's central bank.
Jeffrey Lacker was the president of the Federal Reserve of Richmond. He's resigned after admitting he'd broken confidentiality rules in a conversation with a financial analyst in 2012. During the exchange, the analyst revealed that he had secret information about an interest rate decision, and Mr. Lacker failed to report that information to the bank. That sort of information is highly sensitive, and the Fed's been investigating the source of this leak for years. A look now at some more of today's business headlines for you. The music streaming service Spotify has signed a new deal with record giant Universal. It'll allow Spotify's paying subscribers access to new releases for 2 weeks before they appear on the free service, while Universal, in exchange, will get access to valuable data on what music people are streaming. The deal is a major milestone for Spotify, which is trying to sign similar long-term arrangements with Sony and Warner. Alitalia has cancelled 60% of its flights today as unions begin strike action at the airline. The parties are set to begin marathon talks tomorrow on a rescue plan for the loss-making Italian carrier. Unions have already rejected a plan to cut 2,000 jobs. And Amazon is set to begin refunding as much as $70 million to customers whose children made in-app purchases without their permission. The Federal Trade Commission says it's reached a deal with the online retailer over the issue after complaints the company hadn't put in place sufficient safeguards. The refunds will concern transactions between 2011 and 2016.
And finally from you, Stephen, Warren Buffett, that billionaire investor, is going to become a familiar face in China now.
An even more familiar face, in fact, because his face is going to appear on cans of cherry Coke in China. Now, he gave his permission for his image to be used in a series of limited edition cans. They've just launched cherry Coke in mainland China. His firm, Berkshire Hathaway, is the biggest investor in Coke. It owns around 10% of the company. And Mr. Buffett, whose investment advice is followed around the world, is particularly popular in China. So a spokesperson for Coca-Cola says they were surprised that he agreed to it, but so far he's selling well in drinkable version.
Would you like to have Warren Buffett on your Coca-Cola can?
Coke. I don't like cherry Coke, to be perfectly honest.
Well, there you go.
So.
Not even a question you need to consider. Stephen Carroll with The Business, thank you very much. And we're crossing over the desk to Haxie Wise-Belkin, who's here with the International Press Review. Hi, Haxie.
Hi, Belle.
And we're starting, of course, with that gas attack or suspected gas attack in Syria.
Absolutely. And this, of course, is the story that's being covered all around the world today, with all Western papers unanimous in their belief that the suspected chemical attack was the work of the Syrian regime. One piece in British left-wing paper The Guardian caught my eye. It's written by a member of the Syrian White Helmet rescue organisation who analyses yesterday's EU meeting to discuss the reconciliation process in Syria in the context of this suspected chemical weapon attack. The author reminds us that after the attack, the hospital where the injured were being treated was itself bombed, and also notes that doctors in Syria are labelled terrorists by the regime and they're routinely singled out for persecution. The author then alludes to reports that a number of leading European politicians are considering striking a deal with the Assad regime to bring the conflict to an end, an idea that horrifies the author. I quote, "It's beyond belief that the perpetrators of most of the violence could effectively be rewarded for their crimes."
And you found an article in the Arabic-speaking press that very much echoes that sentiment as well.
Yeah, so if we take a look at Al-Quds, which is a pan-Arab daily newspaper based in London, we see a rather impotent Antonio Guterres there, the UN Secretary General, assessing the devastation of the alleged chemical attack in Syria and saying rather limply that he is concerned by the situation. This as the Syrian regime continues to bombard its own people with prohibited weapons. That's what it says on that rocket there. The title is pretty unequivocal. The Syrian regime carries out a genocide in Idlib. Saudi paper Al Hayat, meanwhile, is running this extremely powerful image on its front page, an image, it's worth saying, that appears in a lot of coverage of this story today. We see a man carrying the lifeless body of a young girl through the rubble, a stark reminder that among the victims of this attack were dozens of civilians, among them women and children. Alongside that extremely powerful image, the headline reads, "Trump administration tested."
And that's something the American press has been quite quick to seize on as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, so in this analysis piece in the New York Times, we read that while the White House did, of course, issue a statement condemning the atrocity, Trump's spokesman in the same breath rejected the idea that Assad should be booted out because of, quote, the political realities that exist within Syria. For this paper, definitive proof, if we even needed it, that Trump has dispensed with what he considers pointless moralising and preachy naivety. His America First approach, we read here, focuses not on how other nations treat their people, but on what they can do for the US.
And let's stay in the US now, because you've picked out a story that just seems to be growing and growing over there. It's the fallout in revelations in the New York Times that Fox News and its anchor Bill O'Reilly had paid millions of dollars in settlements to 5 women who accused the network star of sexual harassment.
Yeah, so the big news today is that the list of advertisers who've decided to halt their advertising partnerships with O'Reilly's show is just getting longer and longer. It now includes the likes of GlaxoSmithKline, Mercedes-Benz and Hyundai, just to name but a few. In the case of the latter, Hyundai, because the company seeks to partner only with companies that share Hyundai's vision of inclusion and diversity. Now, that's from Hyundai's own statement. But this article just isn't buying that. We read here that O'Reilly has always taken the side of racists and misogynists. It's not mincing its words. The only difference now being that the tide of public opinion has changed. Sexual harassment has only now become something of a red line, and that's why big companies are pulling their support for his show. Although there's also a very interesting piece in the Washington Post that wonders whether this latest scandal may actually boost O'Reilly's ratings. We read that because the Fox News demographic is composed of people who feel that liberal elites are out to get them, his viewers' first thought may not be that he's a sexual predator, but rather that the world is out to get Bill O'Reilly.
Let's move on to South Africa now, and the fallout of the news that the country's largest trade union, COSATU, is calling on President Jacob Zuma to step down.
Yeah, so South African paper The Sowetan today is reporting that Zuma actually personally called the head of COSATU in a bid to change their mind, and that, well, it seems to have worked, at least in part. When journalists later asked the trade union boss if his group would consider retracting their call for Zuma to stand down, he said they would actually consider that option. So Zuma there very much unsure of whose support he can count on right now. Although one person he absolutely cannot count on for support is the 15-year-old who's published an open letter to the South African president on the news website IOL today. It's quite an impressive, strong read. Among the accusations that this teenager levels at Zuma are cronyism and the alleged self-interest of Zuma's recent wide-ranging cabinet reshuffle and the subsequent fall of the value of the rand. The letter is signed off, "Be the patriot we wish you were, and resign," quite simply.
Let's end with something a little lighter, a little sparklier, a little pinker.
Absolutely. So in the South China Morning Post this morning, we read that the Pink Star Diamond, which is the largest internally flawless, fancy, vivid pink diamond ever graded, that's their name for it, not mine, has fetched an eye-watering $71.2 million for that stone. And that is a record. So the company, the jewellers that bought that stone will be rather happy with themselves today, I think.
Well, I remember the first time that one went up for grabs, and it was a consortium that tried to buy it, and they couldn't eventually get the money together. So the price that it had gone for couldn't be raised, and they had to put it back on auction.
These guys have succeeded where they failed.
Oh, well done them. Haxi, thank you very much for the International Press Review. Now, we're going to take a short break now, but still to come in the second half of the programme, Germany, maybe known in the last couple of years for its open arms policy towards refugees, but that's all about to change, with thousands being flown back to the homes they fled. Find out how in Focus, coming up later in the programme.
You love watching France